Geographers, this is the first special wonderful edition in what will be a long series of podcasts to support you with your AQA GCSE Geography. What's going to happen is every week I'm going to go through one of the case studies you will need for your paper 1 or paper 2, and they're going to be associated resources and help sheets like my Google Slides, like the worksheets that we've used in class to make sure you know and have all the knowledge about this study. So without further ado, let's kick off with one of the most fundamental, which is our tectonic hazard, and we studied the Haiti earthquake. Now this one's really important because Haiti is our LIC, our lower income country example, and the impacts and the responses here were really significant. So first thing that you need to be able to do is understand the difference between the primary and secondary impacts, and that's there on slide 1. So you need to be able to understand the difference between what happened immediately and what happened later, what happened afterwards because of that immediate impact. So for example, a primary impact would be buildings were destroyed, the ground shook, the buildings weren't strong enough to survive and they crumbled. That would be the primary impact. A secondary impact would be then, well, people were made homeless. They could not live in these homes. They were there surviving in tents and in basically essentially emergency camps set up by charities like the Red Cross. So that's what you need to do first of all. You need to just understand the difference between the two. On slide 2, you'll see there's a little task for you to do to actually recall all the facts you know about this case study. So pause me now and have a go. Okay, I'm back. On slide 3, I've popped some of these facts. Now, you don't have to remember the date off by heart, just remember it was 2010. And it's crucial that you know that the epicenter, the heart of this earthquake, was incredibly close to the capital city. I've popped on my slides, it was 15 kilometres. That to you and me is about 7 miles. So essentially, if we take ourselves from Hedge End, drive ourselves to Fareham, that is how close the epicenter was to that capital city of 3 million people. Now, to take a step back and just think about plates again and what causes this, this was a conservative plate margin. I've got a little diagram on my slides for you because this is where the plates are actually moving past each other. They're moving past, but they're not nice and smooth like the edges of a desk or your dinner table. They're actually jagged and they get stuck. And this pressure and this friction builds and builds and builds until finally, snap. There is a sudden jolt and a release of all that energy, sending out shockwaves. So take a moment now just to revise and go over yourself actually the two other different types of plate margin. We've got destructive, where actually crust is subducted and destroyed, and then we've got constructive, where actually new crust is created, such as with the country of Iceland and the volcanic activity there. So take a pause, look through your previous notes, have a little look on BBC Bite Size and take a moment to revise the plates now. Okay, I'm back. I've gone on to slide 5. What are the effects, or which effects are primary and which are secondary? So let's have another little recap. Primary is initial and secondary is the after effects. So on slide 6, I've got some key ones. You're not going to need to remember all of these, but you are going to need to remember if they are social, economic and environmental as well as primary and secondary. So I'm taking one here that an estimated 316,000 people died. Those deaths are actually a primary impact. Sadly, the death happened quite soon after the ground was shaking. Although not all deaths, some of them actually happened later on. So some happened perhaps due to the spread of diseases like cholera. So the outbreak, due to the fact that there was no great sanitation, actually we would say that with the contaminated water supplies and the cholera is actually a secondary impact. Because they didn't have any aid, because there was no clean water, people later died due to this impact. So take a couple of minutes and sort these into primary and secondary and see if you can also sort them into social, economic and environmental. Okay, let's have a little recap. So primary effects, 316,000 people died. Now that is massive. absolutely massive. Can you believe the trauma and the stress that would bring to a country? Families decimated and wiped out. Parents, aunties, uncles, children. Wouldn't just take out one member in your family, this would be several members of your family. Further to that, 300,000 were injured. And these weren't just the Haitians, these were people who were trying to help. These were people who were then rescuing later and got caught in aftershocks or in the associated disease outbreak later on. We had 1 in 3 buildings collapse, 1 in 3. Can you believe that? Not just homes, these would be businesses. Remember I taught you that there was actually a textiles factory making clothes for Primark, and sadly that was destroyed. So they actually lost their livelihood, which would be the secondary impact of that factory being destroyed. 1.5 million made homeless. There's only 3 million people that live in Haiti and the surrounding area, so half of all its people were made homeless. Hospitals had collapsed, the phone network was down. Key infrastructure, like the control tower of the airport, was damaged, the seaport, the harbour was broken. These are all significant primary effects, which then led to all these secondary effects. We've talked about the contaminated water supplies, we've talked about the outbreak of cholera. They think about 25,000 deaths actually were due to that. There was violence, sadly, and looting, and this didn't help, and more people suffered that needed to because there was no government systems in the country. People were sleeping on the streets, rough, because the aid took 48 hours to arrive. It was absolutely carnage. Sadly, due to the amount of deaths, there were bodies decomposing in the Caribbean heat. They couldn't bury the dead quick enough, and that led to the further spread of diseases and the dysentery and the cholera. And as I said earlier, these people lost their livelihood. We know, and I've taught you, that they actually sometimes eat mud cakes because actually they don't have enough food a day. They are so poor. 60% of Haitians live on less than 80 pence per day. So these people, with the few jobs they had, like making clothes for big companies like Primark, they truly, truly lost everything. So we've gone through quite a lot of facts. You've had some time to pause and have a think. And I now want you to go to slide 9 and actually have a go at a question. You are going to assess the extent to which primary effects are more significant than the secondary. And you're going to use a figure to help you do this. Why? Well, because your exam is going to be full of figures, and using a figure helps you to actually get the level 2 marks, 4, 5 and 6. And you're going to practice because of that command, assess the extent. This is where we're going to remember our structure on the one hand, on the other hand, and we are going to have a conclusion. So if you look at slide 10, I'm going to ask you to decide where you are on that scale. Do you think the primary was more significant, or do you think the secondary was? Take a moment to have a decision and have a think. I myself am going to go for the primary effects at the moment. If we didn't have actually 1 in 3 buildings collapse, I don't think the secondary effects would have been as bad. So have a little look at slide 11. Print it off, or if you've opened this online, why don't you type in those boxes now? What evidence have you got to support that the primary was worse, like 1 in 3 buildings collapsed? What evidence have you got to actually support that the secondary was worse? 1.5 million people homeless, for example, depending on aid and charity. And then go through my following slides on 12. This gives you an idea of how to structure it. So you're actually going to state where you are. You're going to say actually an evaluative comment. You're going to say to a certain extent where you are. Are you thinking primary is more significant or secondary? Then we're going to give our on the one hand, then we're going to give on our other hand, and then you're going to make a conclusion. So on slide 13, actually that figure A on slide 13 is actually a photo from Haiti. How ironic, the AQA exam board actually used a photo from Haiti. Look at that devastation. Look, it shows you the 1 in 3 buildings collapsed. Of course, if you fancy giving yourself a challenge, you could use figure 5B. You could think about a volcano, and you could now take some time to revise Guatemala. Any questions, you know what I always say, drop in. I do lunchtime ESPs, so come and see me on Thursdays or Fridays over in my classroom, or ping me an email and get in touch. Thanks for listening, everybody. Just a reminder that these resources will be available on our Google Classroom. And for anybody else listening out there on the great world wide web, I shall pop a link with this podcast for where I will share this. I've also, specifically for my students, popped some extra fact files and help on our Google Classroom. So head there so you can follow along and make this revision stick.